Hello, all you wonderful people. Let's talk about conclusions. So, our goal is a conclusion that's powerful and that's academic. However, with this paper, with the problem solution paper, it might be a little bit tricky because usually or often in the conclusion, we sometimes address the solution. So, what do we do next? What do we do about this issue? But you have a whole section in your paper that spans at least a couple paragraphs where you talk about the solution. So, you may be a little bit stuck as to what your conclusion should do. And conclusions always seem to be tricky for students too. It's what we talk about in a lot of face-to-face tutorials. Students don't often have a lot of confidence about it. They say things like, I'm not good at conclusions. I never know what to do in the conclusion. So there's a lot of lack of self-confidence about how the conclusion should go. So I just want to remind you that, throughout the paper, but especially in the conclusion, because the conclusion is the last word that you have to give to your audience. In the conclusion, you really want to remind yourself what your audience and your purpose for writing are. So the purpose is the reason you are writing about this topic. So what you want to happen, what you want from this. Yes, you want people to know about it, but what do you want your readers to do? So keep in mind audience when you think about that purpose. So a lot of you may be dealing with big international issues. So one thing you want to change is laws or sanctions or, the way that industry pollutes the ocean, right? But those people aren't the ones who are likely to be reading your paper. And I know we're in a little bit of hypothetical, you're thinking of an imaginary audience, but if this paper were published, if you put this paper out into the world for real, beyond just me, your instructor, who would you actually be talking to? And so even though your solution section might deal with those big, gigantic types of changes that you want to happen, your conclusion is the space where you talk to your actual readers about what you want from them. So in the academic conclusion, you're going to go through a couple different steps as you transition through. So this is sort of just general structure of a conclusion. First, in the conclusion, you wrap it all up. You wrap up the paper by reminding your readers of what you've said so far. And this wrap-up section should be pretty brief, like 1 to 2 sentences. You also can broaden the scope of the paper. So a 6 to 8 page paper has a lot of limitations, but in the conclusion, you can sort of go beyond what's allowed to be in the paper to make some recommendations beyond that. So we'll talk in the next couple slides about what it might look like to broaden the scope of the paper. A conclusion should always explain the significance of your paper. In other words, significant means why it matters. Why this topic matters, especially why it should be significant to your audience. Remember, this is a persuasive paper. So your goal is to be persuasive toward your actual realistic audience. So why should just a random everyday person who might read your paper, why should they find this topic significant to them? So in other words, make it relevant to your audience. It's also your chance to reflect on the paper, offer any final thoughts you have about the topic, and the conclusion is the place in the paper where you want your language to be the most powerful. So we'll sort of talk about some of these in more detail here coming up. So when I say broaden the scope of the paper, here's some ways that you might do that. Now, you do not need to do all of these things. These are just ways that you can approach the idea of broadening the scope of the paper. Think about why it matters. Think about why it's an important issue for people to know about. For example, if you're talking about, pollution in China, why should people in America know about this? Why should it matter to people in America? Just your average everyday reader living in your country, why should they care about this thing? Or, people who aren't nurses, why should they care about this issue impacting nurses? Why should people care? And what do you want from readers? So you can use some powerful phrases like, we must do this, we need to do this. You can also think about what's going to happen in the future. So what are some negative or positive consequences? Negative consequences if we don't react appropriately, positive consequences if we do react appropriately. So you could use some phrases like, if we don't do anything about this, then this will happen. And this is the conclusion is the place where you can be a little bit dramatic. Whereas in the rest of the paper, you want to be much more restrained in your tone. But the conclusion is a place where you get to use powerful language and you get to make emotional appeals. I also want to remind you of a bookends, intro, and conclusion. So if you did something super cool in the intro, like a personal story, somebody else's personal story, a news story, if you got philosophical with some big concept like freedom or education, come back to that. So if you did the philosophical thing in the intro, come back to that definition of freedom in the conclusion and reflect on it now that the paper is concluded. Or if you started with somebody's personal story, mention that person again and talk about, we could help people like this if only we did this, right? So that bookends can be a really tidy way. It's very satisfying for your reader because they feel that sense of closure. You're ending where you started, but with insight now, right? We have the insight of your paper that now reveals something to us about that original place that we started. So when I say use powerful language to leave an impression, powerful language will leave your readers with a lasting impact, and that's what you want, right? You want people to be changed as a result of learning these things about your paper. You want to make them feel, you want to make them think, and you want to make them want to act about your topic. So what do you want your readers to think about and what do you want your readers to feel? This is your chance to use emotional appeals. You should be using them throughout the paper, but especially in your intro, you want to hit this really hard. In fact, your last couple sentences are going to have your most powerful language, and they're probably going to contain emotional appeals or like a call to action, like do this, we need to do this. If we want a world where children can learn freely, we must do this, right? And that's where you hit your solution again, but also your suggestion to your actual legitimate readers. Here, just to give you one example, is the conclusion from that Yemen paper that we've been using as an example throughout this little unit. So here in the top, I've got our questions. What should your reader... Oh, that's a typo. Sorry about that. Why should your readers care? What do you want your readers to do, think about, and feel? And then I've highlighted, sort of color-coded within this conclusion to help you see where this writer is doing those moves. So, America alone does not hold the ethical responsibility of providing support to the people of Yemen, but those who desire a culture free of civilian casualties due to war must advocate for change. So here we want to think about and feel, so some of these are going to overlap, right? We've got words like free, of civilian casualties. So these will trigger an emotional response in people. And then advocate for change is what we want our readers to do. Children, mothers, and fathers are in desperate need of peace. That is an emotional appeal because of the language that's used. Peace may be brought about by volunteer efforts, donations, withdrawal of American-provided lethal weapons. That's actually, that should be yellow. That's something we want our readers to do, right? Here in this sort of light pink, if change is not seen, Yemen will continue to hold the title of the worst humanitarian crisis. So we want people to think about what the consequences might be and make them want to care about it. And this is a really nice example of an if-then type of thing. So if change is not seen, then Yemen will continue to hold the title of the worst humanitarian crisis. That sort of ultimatum type of thing. What are the future consequences if we don't act on this? Here we have some emotional phrasings, and it's drawing up things that will trigger an emotional response. Mothers will continue to fear the safety of their children. Children will be involuntarily victims of war. And then a little bit of courage, right? A little bit of inspiration. This will be a difficult feat to conquer, but we can be the difference. And then again, what do you want? Lessening militant factors and a boost in humanitarian efforts. So lots of all this conclusion type of moves to make the conclusion pretty powerful here. So you can definitely use this as a model, as inspiration. We're still developing writers at this stage in your academic career, so it's okay to look at some models and think, how can I mirror some of these things in my own writing? So now is a good time to take a look at your conclusion or maybe type out a draft wherever you are in the paper. it could be a good idea to type out a draft of your conclusion at this point because it can really help you define that sense of audience and purpose and what you want. And it can also make you a little bit fired up about your topic. As you're convincing other people it's important to care about, that could convince you it's important to care about, and that will help motivate you to continue on with your paper, I hope. So as always, I'm happy to help via email if you have a specific question about something that you need advice on in your paper. Have a good day, writers. Bye.